Today, Great.com talks with Nicholas Paul Bryzowicz, who is Director of Strategy at the Long Now Foundation, a nonprofit that serves as a center of gravity for long-term projects and long-term thinkers around the world. If you haven't heard of them, they are an organization that hopes to provide a counterpoint to today's speeding culture and help make long-term thinking more common. If you're new here to this podcast, please press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today we'll learn why someone wants to build a 10,000-year clock and also save all the languages spoken in the world. Hi, Nicholas. Welcome to our podcast.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for having me.
Could you please explain to me, what is the Long Now Foundation?
So the Long Now Foundation is a nonprofit here in San Francisco. We're looking at the systemic issues that give rise to these social problems. And so we see one of the main systemic issues that we're uniquely situated to address as a lack of long-term thinking. And so this isn't advocating for long time scales over short time scales, but it's saying in a world in which we've gotten quite good at solving our short-term needs for a lot of people, a lot of things that we have figured out, a lot of the advances in technology are addressing things that are very proximal. Can we be a vector for more appreciation, more awareness of, more advocacy for long-term thinking? And long-term for us is in the time scale of about 10,000 years. That's the time scale of civilization itself. So about 10,000 years ago, we came out of an ice age. The agricultural revolution came along. We started living together in cities. And most of what we think of as modern life can be traced back to about that time scale. A lot of people right now in the world like to talk about how civilization is nearing the end of its story, that we're kind of towards the end of this, that our powers have grown such that we are now, a threat to ourselves and that humanity may not last very long. And we're pushing back on that narrative and saying, well, what if you, instead of putting yourself at the end of the civilizational story, saw yourself as in the middle of a 20,000 year story, 10,000 years back, all the way to the warming, and then 10,000 years into the future. This would put you in the middle of the story. It would give you a sense of agency. It would help you see that you have 10,000 years of successes behind you, even as you have 10,000 years of challenges ahead of you. And we're quite well equipped to deal with the things that we have challenges for. So humanity is actually, our take on the challenges of things like climate change or antibiotic resistance or global pandemics is that these are things that humanity can and will get good at. And part of that begins with just thinking on these longer time scales.
So how do you help make long-term thinking more common? How your organization, how do you do?
So the organization started 25 years ago with one project in particular, which is known as the Clock of the Long Now, or the 10,000-year clock. Danny Hillis, who's a computer scientist, had this idea that we could use a symbol to the future the same way that the pyramids are a symbol for the past. And what would that look like? And when you really think about that for a bit, you start realizing that what we think of as a mechanical clock actually includes the future within it. That state of affairs is currently in the clock or in a clock. And so this idea of a monument scale clock that would keep good time for 10,000 years started to take shape. And folks like Brian Eno and Stuart Brand and Kevin Kelly and Peter Schwartz started coming into conversation around this project and thinking about, well, what are the implications of this? What else would you be thinking of? And some other projects fell out of this too. So that clock, by the way, is still under construction. It's been under design and construction, like I said, for about a quarter century. But it's spun off some other ideas, which is, well, if you're going to have a clock that lasts for 10,000 years, what do we think about keeping a library that lasts 10,000 years, and what would be in that library? And some of those conversations come up. Of course, as soon as you start thinking about a library, you invoke the question of language. What kind of a language are we going to speak in 2,000 years and 5,000 years? And you realize that actually preserving human languages is a really important part of being a good ancestor. And so we started working with something called the Rosetta Project, where we were collecting dictionaries, grammars, vocabulary lists, parallel text translations of things like the United Declaration of Human Rights. And you started collecting all of these bits of information and archiving them. And then the question is, well, how do you best archive human language for long timescales? And we were working with some folks to micro etch nickel discs, with all of this language documentation. And eventually organizations like the European Space Agency helped us land one of these archives on a comet 67P, that rubber ducky shaped comet that was in the news a few years ago. Part of that payload was one of these Rosetta disks, an archive of all human language. We also helped land one on the moon a couple summers ago. And then there's about 100 terrestrial copies of this archive as well. So you end up with something like this. But then, of course, you're thinking, again, more capaciously about what we can do to think long term. And you start talking to experts and such. And so we started a seminars program where we invite world-class experts to talk about their work in this very unique context of the next and last 10,000 years. So we had the seminars program, eventually a membership program, a global membership program took shape. And at this point, we have almost 12,000 members across 65 countries that are all long-term thinkers who care about this space and want to connect with other people who are thinking in a new light on the things that we're doing today. So we have a membership program. And of course, I think I was mentioning it earlier before we hit record. We have an award-winning cocktail bar here in San Francisco that also has a 2-story floor-to-ceiling library and has some museum exhibits from our various projects like the Clock Project available for people to look at. All of these are really trying different ways of getting people to think long-term, because your question's a good one. How do you actually help people think about their lives and their actions on the time scale of millennia? And we don't know. There's no real proven way to do this. And so we're kind of throwing everything we can at it. For some people, the clock is this mythic symbol. It's very inspirational. It gets them to think about themselves in a new context. For other people, it's thinking about the archival projects and how do we archive knowledge? How do we archive language? Why do we archive language? These provocative questions get them thinking in this way. And for other people, it's just meeting a friend for a cocktail in San Francisco and finally having this excuse to think about things in this more expansive framework. So it's different for everybody. And we're trying to do as many different things as we can to see what works. As we move forward, we're actually looking for other people all around the globe who are doing this in their own way. And we're finding new ways of integrating them with our work. And we're trying to actually give birth to a field of long-term thinking and actually connecting all of the people who have different perspectives on it together so that we can learn together.
You're building a clock that's going to last for 10,000 years.
Yes.
How is that going to work? The clock.
The clock itself is a mechanical clock. It's designed to not be so complicated that you couldn't sit and stare at it for a while and figure out how it works. It's pretty nakedly available to you when you enter into. It's inside of a mountain. It's about 500 feet high, and it's in a mountain in West Texas. And when you go to visit it, probably one of the more unique things about it is that it also has a unique bell chime generator. So every good clock has to have a solid bell chime. And at solar noon, the clock of the long now will play on your visit, will play a bell chime sequence that no human being has ever heard before you. And no human being will ever hear it after you. There's 3.65 million unique bell chime sequences possible for the clock. And that bell chime generator was designed by the British musician Brian Eno, kind of part of his exploration of generative music. And so it's a unique structure. It's mechanical. There's a white paper on all the different ways that it keeps good time and how it tracks absolute time and solar time and makes corrections. It gets pretty technical, and I'm pretty sure your audience doesn't want to get into the absolute weeds on some of that stuff. But there are resources on our website at longnow.org for anyone who really wants to dive into exactly how the clock is keeping time, maintaining its power, how it's responding to visitors. All of that information is available on our website.
Yeah, I saw that any visitor could wind it up and then hear the tunes play. But aren't you afraid that there'll be like vandalism, or how do you even get to the clock?
Yeah, well, the clock is a pretty aggressive hike, so you would have to really want to get there. It's a fairly remote location. Things like vandalism, things like people misunderstanding what they've encountered, these are all possibilities. In fact, these kinds of ideas, these questions you're asking, are the purpose of this project. It as opposed to just writing a science fiction book or a white paper about this idea, like, oh, what if we made a 10,000-year clock? There's something really provocative about going for it and really creating a physical artifact in the world that gets people to confront these questions of what does it mean to have something in the world that wants to persist for 10,000 years? How are people going to relate to it in the future? What are humans going to be like in the future? You think about visitors and, well, who's going to be visiting in 2,000 years, 5,000 years, 7,000 years?
Yeah.
These are all the kinds of questions that it's otherwise kind of hard to get people to take seriously. But when you are doing something like this and you're actually, spending 25 years developing this thing, it surfaces a lot of these questions. And I think wrestling with these is a good thing for us to do.
I saw that you were building one in Nevada eventually, and I travel a lot to Vegas, so I'll for sure go out there and have a look at that clock. I'm really curious about how it looks and works.
The Nevada property is actually where the clock was originally going to be housed. What we discovered in the Nevada property, we have this mining claim on Mount Washington. What we discovered was the largest privately held stand of bristlecone pine trees in the world. If you didn't know, bristlecone pine trees are the longest lived non-clonal organisms on Earth. Some of the bristlecone pine trees in Nevada and California, they're older than the pyramids at Giza. They're thousands of years old and they've been alive, but they're almost like stones, more than trees. So there's some really cool stuff happening in Nevada. There's no clock there right now. The clock is currently under construction in West Texas. But
okay.
we do have this amazing affordance in Nevada to also help people think long-term there. And thinking about what we're going to do with that space is part of our vision for the next 25 years.
Okay. So you mentioned the Rosetta Project, saving all the languages in all the languages in the world?
All the languages we can save. We're living in a great extinction for languages. I think last I checked, we're losing a language about every 2 months. Most of these are, things like indigenous languages that aren't spoken by a lot of people, and that as the generations go by, new generations are losing the thread. They're not learning it. They're learning another language. One might think like, well, that's efficient, right? It'd be most efficient if all of humanity spoke a single language. It'd be quite nice to just know you could communicate with anybody. But there is something actually that you lose when you lose a language. You lose access to a certain kind of worldview. The more you study foreign languages and other languages, especially languages that are not directly related to the languages that you speak, you start realizing that there's just a lot that gets encapsulated or encoded in a language, a lot of metaphors, a lot of ways that people understand the world. And you don't want to lose that because you don't really know you don't always know what you're losing. When you think on long time scales, one of the principles that surfaces up as a pretty unalloyed good is this idea of preserving possibilities for the future. That if you're equipping the future generations with as much of these kinds of things as you can, as many languages as possible, you're allowing them then to have the broadest range of choices through which they can decide what they need for their time to fit their environment. And so we might think to ourselves right now, well, all you really need is, Chinese, English, maybe 2 other languages, and we're set.
Mm-hmm.
But that appeals to a certain part of our brain, but it really misses something, which is, well, one, we don't know what the future is going to be like. We don't know what kind of value we're missing out on by having these languages go extinct. And to the extent that we can preserve them through documentation, to the extent that we can allow people to translate amongst them, which again is the Rosetta Stone, the inspiration for the Rosetta Project, is this, it created the affordance for us to be able to translate between some languages we otherwise wouldn't have been able to. You start thinking about this is generally a good thing for the future. It's one of the many things we can do to be good ancestors.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the translation is, I speak a few languages myself. I think like in the future, we're all going to have little babble fishes put in our ear and then we're just going to hear straight away. But I think it's kind of romantic being able to speak the native language of somebody else. In that archive, what kind of information do you think you should go in there?
So broadly, the archive contains things like dictionaries, a list of words, vocabulary lists, Swadesh lists. There's grammars, and of course, parallel text translations of texts like Genesis or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So these texts that once you've translated into multiple languages, this kind of allows people to triangulate a sense of meaning through a variety of different sources. And it's not perfect. It's not the same as continuing the unbroken thread of a spoken language, but it's the next best thing. It's a kind of a cultural save point that we can create relatively inexpensively, that we can save in places I think just the archiving project itself begs some interesting questions about how you should go about archiving information for the future. So as you asked, like, what do we archive? What do we want to save for the future? How do people access it? So famously, our Rosetta Disk project, it doesn't store this information in a set of zeros and ones that are encoded like with a compact disc or a DVD or something. It's actually an image, like a screen printed T-shirt almost, but shrunk down so that each page of documentation is about 5 human hairs wide. The idea being that this is still optically readable. You can look at this disc and read the information on it. You don't need a special kind of, for me, technology, even just 20 years ago, if somebody handed me a CD, I'd really have to think about how I would access that information. There's no CD drive in my laptop these days. I don't have a CD player in my house. I'd have to really get creative. I think I probably got a friend with a drive I could borrow or something. But so when you're thinking about storing information for thousands of years, it really begs the question of just how accessible things are. And of course, what are the ethics? What are the aesthetic principles that drive the decisions of what we save and what we store? For us, we wanted to begin that project by storing languages, by saving this language documentation for the future.
Do you have any other projects?
We do. We have a large variety of projects, and we're adding some more here in the next 25 years. I think one thing that we haven't talked about, though, that I'd like to make sure that we do discuss is just why long-term thinking matters. Why does it matter that we can start as a civilization thinking about things in century timescales or millennial timescales? It's really come to a head because there are challenges in our world right now that can only be apprehended if you're looking at timescales beyond the human lifetime. Things like asteroid deflection, things like antibiotic resistance, things like geoengineering or climate change. These are challenges that aren't the kinds of things that we could start a business and succeed at meeting those challenges within a lifetime. We have to get better at thinking about long time scale phenomena, being aware of long time scale phenomena, but then also how do we work across generations? So these are some interesting questions. There's competing responses to that question. Right now, we have one of our newer projects is the Organizational Continuity Project, where our executive director, Alexander Rose, is traveling through the world to meet people who are involved in endeavors and enterprises that have lasted for hundreds of years, or in some cases over 1,000 years. These are things like breweries, brasseries, hotels, universities, religious organizations. And the question that we're trying to understand is, how does one maintain continuity across generations? Are there best practices? What do we not know about the space of continuity? Because if we want to address a 300-year phenomena, we're going to need to maintain the goal and our vision for 300 years. And institutions are one of the social technologies by which we can do that. Because again, I can't do that. Right now, I'm highly incentivized to find some kind of problem in the world that I can solve. Hopefully, ideally within the next 5 to 10 years. That's kind of the attention span for someone's professional endeavors, generally speaking. But what if we started seeding some cultural examples where you don't have to be the person who completes a project, but you can still be the person who starts it. Or rather, you don't have to be the person who started it, but you can continue it one more generation. And then eventually somebody is going to be the person to bring a project home. But we don't really have a whole lot of scripts and examples for these multi-generational endeavors. So the Long Now Foundation is doing our best to identify these examples and curate them and surface them, and then possibly think about how we could improve on what we do know. So that all kind of begins with a learning journey. And we're on that journey right now to think about how do we get better at addressing and attending to multi-generational phenomena, centuries, millennia.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear you. I get really curious and excited to see what's going to happen in the future.
That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Glad to hear that.
So what action steps can someone take to be part of the solution, to help you?
Yeah, I think the most immediate thing someone can do if they find this kind of work interesting is go to the website, longnow.org, LONGNOW. Long now, by the way, is this time scale of 20,000 years, as opposed to the now of this conversation. The long now is the now of civilization, 10,000 years into the past, 10,000 years into the future. So longnow.org is the website. And of course, we have a membership program. Our membership program starts at $8 a month. and it takes like 2 minutes to set up. And so we've got about 12,000 members now across 65 countries all over the globe. And we are constantly publishing information, sending newsletters to our members, inviting them in for these events and conversations about various expert perspectives on long-term thinking. Our members are the first to find out about any of the work that we're doing, any of the new projects that we're launching. And of course, our ultimate goal is to really pull together a network, a discursive field of people who care about and are thinking about long time scales. And as we move into the next 25 years, what we're calling our next quarter, as we kind of round the bend of our first 25 years, as we look at that next 25 years, this is becoming increasingly a priority for us, is connecting all of these people. So if someone's interested, I would definitely say sign up for membership, check out the website, check out our YouTube channel and any of our other social media platform profiles. Make sure you're connected with us. And then as we go into this next quarter, we can go into it together. And if there's something of interest to you, please do reach out.
Brilliant. Brilliant. For you listening, if you enjoy this episode, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app. That will show the algorithms that this is an important conversation, so more people can learn about the importance of long-term thinking. Thank you very much, Nicholas.
Thank you, Peter.